I'm Jessica. I never imagined I'd be here sharing something so personal, but I'm hoping this will be the first step toward forgiveness. For myself, and maybe even for my husband. I've been carrying this burden for a long time, and it's time to face the consequences of my actions. If you've been in a similar situation, or just want to offer advice, I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments after the story. It's not easy to admit, but I'm hoping my confession might help others who feel lost in their own lives. Now, let me take you through the events that led me here. I'm a 34-year-old housewife. My husband Dan and I have been together for 12 years, married for 9. We've built a life together. 2 kids, a home, a steady routine. At first, everything felt perfect, but over the years we'd fallen into a predictable rhythm, and honestly, I started to feel a little invisible. Don't get me wrong, Dan is a good guy. He works hard, provides for us, and is an amazing father. But as time passed, our relationship became more about logistics than love. I tried to make things exciting. I suggested we go on more date nights, explore new hobbies together, even tried to spice up our bedroom life. But he wasn't interested. It was like I was speaking a foreign language when I talked about our intimacy. He'd smile, nod, but the spark just wasn't there for him anymore. I couldn't understand it. I had needs too, and every time I'd approach him about it, I'd feel like a burden. I started to believe it was me, that I wasn't attractive enough. Or maybe I wasn't doing something right. It was around that time that I went to a work conference in another city. I hadn't planned on anything happening. It was just supposed to be an opportunity to learn and network. But as soon as I walked into the hotel bar that night, I met him, Ethan. Ethan wasn't like anyone I'd met before. He was charming, confident, and really listened when I spoke. He made me feel noticed in a way I hadn't in years. As we talked, I could feel the tension between us. He seemed genuinely interested in me, and that felt so good. It wasn't long before we found ourselves alone, talking even more. And then, it happened. One thing led to another. We ended up in a hotel room together. I never intended for any of it to happen, but in that moment, it was like everything I had been missing with Dan was right there in front of me. The excitement, the connection, the thrill of feeling desired again. At first, I justified it to myself. It was just one night. I was just trying to feel good about myself again. But after that night, Ethan kept in touch. He'd send me messages, check in on me, compliment me. It was like a secret world that I didn't want to let go of. We started seeing each other more often. He'd travel for work and we'd meet up in different cities. It was like I was rediscovering a side of myself that I'd buried years ago. But as the months went by, the weight of it all started to settle in. I felt like I was living a double life, and I couldn't escape the guilt that came with it. The more time I spent with Ethan, the more I realized that I wasn't just betraying my husband physically, I was betraying everything I'd built with him. I loved Dan. I truly did. But every time I went home to him, I couldn't look at him the same way. How could I love him and do this to him? The affair was starting to take a toll on me emotionally. I felt like I was being used by Ethan. He wasn't interested in anything more than a physical relationship. I was just another one of his conquests. I knew I was using him too, though. I was trying to fill a void, to find something I felt was missing. But the more I was with him, the more I realized that what I was doing was hurting not only Dan, but myself as well. I became more withdrawn at home, distant from Dan and the kids. I hated myself for it. I hated that I'd let it go on for so long. And then one night, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep lying to Dan, to myself. I had to tell him. But the fear of losing everything, of shattering the family we had built, was overwhelming. It took me weeks to find the courage to tell Dan. When I finally did, it wasn't easy. I told him everything. About Ethan, about the affair, about how I felt so lost, so disconnected, that I'd made one of the biggest mistakes of my life. His face was a mixture of shock and anger. I could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt of someone who trusted and loved me, only to have me betray him. At first, Dan was furious. He didn't want to hear any excuses, and I don't blame him. He felt like he didn't know who I was anymore. We spent that night in silence, with him pacing the living room, trying to process what I'd said. He didn't know if he could forgive me. And honestly, I didn't know if I could forgive myself either. The days that followed were tense. He barely spoke to me. There were times when I thought he might leave, and I wouldn't blame him if he did. But then, slowly, things started to shift. He stopped yelling and started listening. We talked. A lot. We talked about our marriage, about how things had gone wrong, about how we had both neglected the emotional connection that had once been the core of our relationship. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if we'll make it through this. But I do know that telling Dan the truth was the hardest thing I've ever done. And even if our marriage ends because of it, at least I can say I tried to make it right. A year of mistakes, guilt, and betrayal. I don't know where this will go, but I'm hoping to rebuild. If you've gone through something like this, or if you have any advice, I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts. Please leave a comment, and if you want to hear more real confessions like mine, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you again for listening. It means more than you'll ever know.